I look at churches like the ocean. There's just different sized fish. The whale is a beautiful thing, but so is a dolphin. They each have their unique strengths.
Hi, I'm Carl Vaders, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry, and to our multi-episode series based on the content of my new book, Desizing the Church: How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. My guest in this episode is Dave Gibbons. He's the founding pastor of Newsong Church in Orange County, California, very close to where I live, actually. In this episode, we talk about the planting of Newsong and the challenges that Dave faced when he looked around and saw a large church of faces that looked a lot like each other, as he puts it, but that looks very little like the diverse county that they were ministering. Then Dave talks honestly and vulnerably about how the Holy Spirit challenged him to reach out to the Misfits and to the marginalized, how this challenged him and the church in huge ways, and how they even faced a massive drop in attendance because of those decisions. Then he talks about how he had to find his way through all of that emotionally, financially, and spiritually to come out in very recent years to a place of health and strength again, and to a church that is really strong and vibrant and truly is reaching the misfits and the marginalized. And don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with an overview, and I'll let you know who I'll be interviewing in next week's Desizing the Church podcast. Dave Gibbons, thank you so much for being with us. Welcome to the Church Lobby today.
Thank you, man. It's so good to be with you, Carl.
Well, you and I have pastored in Orange County for a long time. We are neighbors, and in fact, we are secondary friends. And the secondary isn't a negative thing. It's just simply you actually know several of my family members who have attended the church that you pastor and served there quite deeply for a lot of years. In fact, you attended my niece's wedding. We had a chance to say hi there, and I've run into you in the coffee shop when you've been talking with friends, that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But it's the first time you and I have had a chance to have a face-to-face conversation, even though it's face-to-face electronically. Start by giving me some of the history of Newsong, because Newsong is a large and influential church in our area, but anybody who's not in Orange County may not know of the background. So give us some history.
Yeah, Newsong started in my apartment in 1994, and it just started growing. We had partnerships with Mariners, which is a big church out here that helped us to meet on their campus. At the time, it was South Coast, led by Tim Timmons, for those who know Orange County. And then as we started growing with their help, facility-wise, it got to the point where we were attracting mostly Asian Americans, but we felt that we were called to reach those not like us, the opposite to what was kind of being purported at the time. We consistently were trying to reach people of different cultures. So our first multi-site wasn't like a franchise model of what we were doing in Irvine. We actually went to what we thought was the hardest place in LA. At that time was Crenshaw. And we launched a church focused on the Black community and with Black leadership. And then eventually our move to Santa Ana, the reason why we moved here was we said, well, who's not like us that we're not really reaching right now and connecting to? And it was the Hispanic, the brown population. And along with that in Santa Ana was the homelessness and the drug addictions, the undocumented. Yeah, so that's how the church evolved. We went from a mega church focused to really going back to our values of saying, well, who's the misfit? Who's the outsider? And how do we reach them and support and resource them?
But you call your church the home of the misfits, and it's not just a saying, because I have attended, and I've said my family is there and very involved. And when we attended this summer, I took a short sabbatical, and so Newsong was one of the churches that we attended. It is very diverse. It is diverse ethnically. It is diverse socioeconomically. A lot of people don't realize this because anybody outside of Orange County, anything they've heard about Orange County is Real Housewives of, or Laguna Beach, or right.
Yeah.
And those are, exaggerations of things that do exist here. But Orange County is actually one of the most diverse counties in the country, both ethnically and socioeconomically. And your congregation right now is in the heart of some of the most ethnically diverse and some of the poorer areas of our county. So talk through some of that, because I know a lot of churches would love to be more diverse. But even the first step as to how to do that, I mean, those are steps you took from here to Crenshaw, and then from Crenshaw here to downtown Santa Ana. These are very brave, intentional steps. Walk us through maybe even how some of that was done that somebody else might be able to learn something from to do that in their own context.
Well, I think as you wrote about in your book, the whole church growth movement was built upon the premise that we're to reach people like us. So we targeted like Saddleback Sam with Saddleback Church and Unchurched Harry Mary with Willow Creek at the time. That kind of bled into, I think, the culture of church planting and church growth. But when I looked at the scriptures, I said, no, when Jesus was asked like who my neighbor is, he actually told a story about the Good Samaritan loving a Jew. So this was like someone who was polar opposite and they hated each other. They couldn't stand one another. And then it really struck me. I had an epiphany. I said, whoa. I said, it's no big deal if you love someone like you. The world doesn't take notice of that. But when you can love someone that people think you should hate or that you wouldn't get along with, people will say, you know what, maybe I'll give you a Nobel Peace Award for that. Like Mother Teresa did with the lepers. To me, when you can love someone like that, that's really where God, I think, is most evident. To me, we made it that our ambition, because we were at the time diverse amongst Asian Americans, because like Japanese and Koreans like black and white, but from a color perspective, from people looking at our church when we were younger, they didn't see the diversity. But I felt compelled, like early on, I said, we got to do it all across the lines. Because at that time, even though we had some diversity amongst Asians, we weren't socioeconomically diverse, nor were we reaching much of the brown and black population. So the question that drove us was, who's most not like us in our area? And where's the darkest and hardest place to go? So there was no doubt that that was Santa Ana. There was an iron curtain between Irvine, Newport Beach, the cities around it, and Santa Ana. And so that really attracted me. I said, dude, why are people avoiding this area? And my guess is that when I looked at scriptures, it seemed that Jesus chose to be born amongst the margins and the marginalized. He related to the marginalized. And so I said, there's something to be noted about this, that maybe the greatest movements start from the margins, not from the center. And so we made that as a priority as we started doing our church development.
We're talking about absolutely the polar opposite of what I've been taught, and I know what you've seen as well. Let's pick the people most unlike us. Dave, that's not supposed to work.
I know. Well, practically it came down to this too. Because God started speaking to me, I felt like, hey, how are you applying this in your life, Dave? Like, who are the people you don't hang out with right now? And at that time, 15, 20 years ago, it was the Black community. I'd always had Black friends, but I wasn't spending time with my Black friends or the Black community or understanding the plight of the Black community in LA and Orange County. And then secondly, it was the brown. I wasn't hanging out with the brown population. The third group was the addicts. And then the fourth group was the gay community. These were all like, I think, really critical social groups that this generation looks upon in terms of like validating whether the church is real or not. Like, can you love these groups of people? And so to me, it became even more of a greater emphasis because I saw the culture was looking at the church and seeing how we were loving those who were experiencing specifically like injustice or some type of hardship.
Doing this where you and I live in the middle of Orange County, which is mega church central, which is all the stereotypes as we talked about. I succumbed for a decade to the megachurch push, to the get the numbers up thing, to who is your target, and let's narrow specifically on that. How did you resist that pull? Not just resist it, but in fact go counter to it in a very purposeful way. I mean, you've already explained some of it, but I'm coming back to it because it is so opposite to what everything else was happening here in Orange County. Is it just simply your heart is drawn to the margins, or is that something you really had to have the Lord help you with?
Well, Jesus only did what he saw his father doing. So when I looked at my life, my mom was a misfit immigrant woman who was divorced. So the church didn't know how to deal with her. So when I looked at my story, I think it was rooted in me that I paid attention to those who were kind of the outsider. Then it came to play when I was building Newsong. We were 10 years into it at the Anaheim Convention Center, and there was like 5,000 young people streaming in. And this would be like the pastor's dream of a church plant. And I remember as I walked on stage, I literally felt I heard God's voice. I felt I heard, "Is this it?" And it was my definition of success. And I tucked it away, not wanting to deal with it. And then as we went into our church building campaign, we were going to buy this huge facility in Orange County off the 5 freeway. It was like the most notable property at the time. And we were raising money for that. But at the last second, Kia Motor Company offered more money for the property than we did. And so these were my own Korean brothers and sisters, right, competing with me. I was disenchanted and wondering, like, God, what are you saying? And then he asked me this series of questions I'll never forget. He said, "You said it wasn't about the building, but what happens inside the building. Maybe what's more important is what happens outside the building." Then the second thing is, he said, "What would the church look like if it's not contained on a piece of land?" And then the third question he asked was, "Dave, what if you don't have to plant any more churches? What if the churches are already there?" And these were like, this was 15 years ago. It was like God was speaking Martian to me. And I don't typically like hear a voice. So I don't want people to think like I hear his voice all the time. I don't. But this voice from God I felt that were the questions. I couldn't shake it. And it put me into the place where I left the ministry for a year to go to Bangkok. And that's when I just pursued God's heart. I said, "God, I don't know what the heck you meant by that." Because all my life I thought it was about building a great church so that we could be influential to reach the masses. And then in Bangkok, I found out it was all about the one. He showed me how one person can change the whole nation, and it rocked me. And I said, wow. And so that's when I started doing a deep dive. I came back to Orange County and I told the elders, I said, "I don't think I'm supposed to be here anymore." And they go, "What?" I go, "Yeah." I go, "If I stay here, I think we're going to totally destroy Newsom." I said, "I think everybody's going to leave." Because I don't know exactly where we're going, but I think the way we've been building this is maybe not the right way. It's not that big's bad, but I think the way we were doing things didn't come from the right place and mission. And the metrics were not the right way. But again, I had no language for this. But over the last like 15 years, I realized there's a whole new code that I didn't know. I didn't have a language for what was being created, nor did I have a clear metrics. And now I feel like I got this download and I'm really clear about how to build this pipeline and what to look at in terms of metrics for the church, which is not numbers, but you alluded to it in your book. It's meaningful engagements. It's meaningful engagements. And then if you look at the leadership pipeline process, what are the phases or priorities or stages of development that people are moving through? Are they being launched then into their future, where they're not anchored to the church as an institution, but they're launched into their dreams, replicating the human development model we call discipleship within their own company or within their own network?
Really come back to the core of what Jesus did, reaching the marginalized, discipling them. And those are the metrics. And you mentioned that I allude to that in my book, and that's because you got an advanced copy fairly quickly before that. You kindly read the 3 chapters I directed you to. But one of the first chapter in the third part of the book, which is, okay, how do we address this, is Discipleship Fixes Everything.
Yeah.
Is the title, right? Because as I've looked around, I've realized that really is, Jesus didn't tell us to make converts. He didn't even tell us to build church buildings. Almost everything we do is stuff that we've added to it. He told us very simply and very clearly, go and make disciples. Conversion is part of discipleship, but it's more than discipleship. Our church life is a tool for discipleship, but it should be a tool towards discipleship. The goal is to make disciples and not to get up the numbers. And there are times when a decision to disciple people is actually going to go counter to getting the numbers up, because metrics can happen fast, but discipleship always happens slowly.
Exactly.
You can't speed up discipleship. And you've made a very conscious choice to go the slow and the deep and the discipleship with the people on the margins. And yet that has worked numerically as well in your context. What would you say to those who have made those similar choices, but haven't seen the numerical increase that you've seen, because that's the point of frustration for a whole lot of pastors. But I did all of that. His numbers went up. Why aren't my numbers going up? What
Okay,
would you say to those folks?
well, we got to blow that myth right away. When we moved from Irvine to Santa Ana, we lost 70% of our people.
70%.
Yep.
Wow.
And so we had to let go of over half our staff. It was I was like a bad guy. I was not the favored child anymore. I was like the crazy one leading our people into a place that no one wants to go.
How did you weather that?
I didn't very well. I was depressed. I think I never had faced that type of darkness in my life. I've always had escalating, scaling numbers. I was used to that. I had never seen like this downward spiral, but I feel God prepared me in Bangkok, where when I was in my devotions, he said, "Are you okay with 300?" At that time we had thousands, but he goes, "Would 300 be enough for you?" And I had just watched the movie 300, so I said, "Of course." you know, Spartans, man. But to be honest, when we started losing people, it was really a struggle because I realized how much numbers made me feel important. And even though I said they don't matter and all that, the truth is they did matter to me. And it made me feel like I was a failure and a loser. And it looks that way because you're not invited as much to certain conferences, or you're thought about as like a failure to the circle. I could tell by the way people are looking at me that they felt sorry for me. Then also you have people talking trash about you because, you have people that were insiders or who were part of the community that didn't understand exactly the move to Santa Ana and to this model. And again, I didn't have the language for it. So I can understand their dismay, their confusion. I get it, but it was a hard process. But I think it was important for me because I said, if I'm gonna go down like this, I'm gonna take it all away. I'm gonna go under the hood of the car and question every system of the car. How do we judge miles per gallon? Who's driving the car? What type of material are we using? What's the language we're using? We question everything again. And then we took the posture to listen. We did surveys within the city. Instead of coming with the idea, oh, we got a plan on how to build the church, we asked the neighborhoods around us, door by door, hundreds of homes, how can we serve you? What's the way that we can really meet your needs? And that's how a lot of our impact started happening, not from the Sunday services. It started from addressing the needs of the city.
How long did this process of trying to figure it out and feeling disjointed, for lack of a better term, how long was that season?
It was 15 years.
15 years of you feeling like you're just not figuring this thing out?
Yeah, I was confused. It wasn't until the last like several years, like 3 to 5 years, that everything started codifying. But I didn't have the language, I didn't have the process, but then everything started clicking during the pandemic. That's when everybody started getting it.
Recently and during the pandemic, what did it feel like when that started clicking? Where did that come from and how did that start to feel?
Well, we started talking about church without walls long ago in our church. So when we couldn't meet as a church community on the physical campus, they suddenly said, "Oh, now we get it, Dave. This is not about the building. It's not about gathering just on Sundays." And then our activities, that when we did gather, we were serving literally 2,000 people every week food all throughout the pandemic, every Friday. Then we reshifted what we did online so that people could take classes online. And so there's relationships that were forming that were not based on the Sunday services.
That's one of the things that I've taught with pastors, even with the distance we have from the pandemic now. I let them know we need to look back at that because the pandemic didn't change anything as far as I'm concerned, but it took the issues and it drew them in bright colors and broad strokes. All of a sudden, stuff that was subtle wasn't subtle anymore. It was in our faces. And that's what happened there. These things that were underlying and that you were trying to get people to see, all of a sudden, boom, it's right in our faces, broad strokes, bright colors, and they finally got it during a season where everybody else is running around in some churches for the first time ever going, what do we do now? We've never had a downturn before. But for you, it was where things clicked into place.
Everything. That's when everything started green lighting. And
Yeah.
I told our whole staff, I go, this is the moment we've been waiting for. This is go time. It was amazing.
As I'm thinking it through, that may be one of the great signs that the track you're on is the right track when in a difficult season, it doesn't throw you, but in fact, it focuses you.
Yeah,
Because the church historically has always been the strongest and the most vibrant when we are facing difficulty and persecution, and we become weak and soft when we get wealthy and happy.
exactly. Yeah, Rodney Stark writes about that in The Rise of Christianity, where he said the first, second century, most of the people would leave the city when there was a disease, a pandemic. But he says the Christians would stay. He said
Yeah.
they're staying at the potential cost of their own lives is the things that everybody noticed. And that's in terms of the love of God and through the love that they showed for those who were sick. And so to me, it was like I told our community, this is our greatest opportunity in our lifetime. God's opened up a window where we can actually love people and they're going to be listening to us, not by our sermons, but actually how we're living out the word. And so to me, it really defined the movement of how we need to move forward. And so everything we do now, we changed the model of how we felt like the way the church analogy of the past was around hospitals, city on a hill, we're the place to come to, the center city type of institution, where I felt, no, we're supposed to be more like an academy where we're graduating people and we're launching them into their communities, just like a university would. And they can always be alumni, but the goal is to take our human development model, which is discipleship, and implementing that into their companies, into their social networks, so that it becomes fluid. So whether they're Muslim, Buddhist, Christian, it doesn't matter. You can meet them where they are, but they're going to experience your love, the love of God through the way you help them assess who they are and help them to find their unique design and come alongside of them to launch them into their dreams. I felt that was the Jesus model. He met them in their need, addressed their need, and then from that experience with Christ, they wanted more. So that model to me is the model we took, and we said that's what really shifted our church to really gaining traction to this vision.
And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are two things you can do for us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Second, consider becoming a financial supporter through Patreon, Venmo, or PayPal. Just go to carlvaders.com/support. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us put these resources into the hands of the ministries that need them the most. Our support link is in the show notes. As we look ahead to the next couple of decades of the church, none of us are going to be foolish enough to make prophecies or predictions, but I think we can maybe anticipate some potential trends in desizing the church. When I get to that third segment where I start looking ahead and saying, what are some potential ways forward? One of the chapters is, as I already said, entitled Discipleship Fixes Everything. The other key chapter that makes that turn is entitled Integrity is the New Competence. I feel like for 40 years now, we've been taught technique. And we've assumed integrity. And now we have far too many stories where people with great technique turned out to not have much integrity. And the damage to the church of those story after story after story are just too many to count, and there's no reason to recount them all today. But as we look ahead with the idea of more discipleship and walking with greater integrity, because a lot of what you're talking about there, even in the way we live our lives among the marginalized people, it is a reestablishing of trust by going to serve them, by saying, who can we serve? What are the greatest needs that we can serve? And then by doing that with integrity, and as we're doing so, that becomes part of the discipleship process. So that's kind of my take on it. What shifts do you see that we need to be making in the church in general as we move forward to regain the trust that has been lost and to reach out to marginalized people who feel especially marginalized by the church?
Yeah, well, I like how you approach it in your book. I think number one is, big's not bad. I look at churches like the ocean. There's just different size fish. The whale is a beautiful thing, but so is a dolphin. They each have their unique strengths. And so to me, I don't think it's about the size. So I think that there's always going to be Costco-like churches forever. There's always going to be hub churches, but their mission should be to resource others. and not just to take over, but to collaborate with local churches and other entities, nonprofits, and businesses. So I think they have to be positioned that way, or they'll be questioned. Their integrity would be questioned. I think the second thing is I do think it's about integrity, but one has to ask what aspect of integrity. So to me, I think integrous in regard to how we demonstrate love. It's not just character. So it is character, we all, of course, but as you can see with our elected politicians, character doesn't matter sometimes. And so what does matter is at the end of the day, what are you doing for me? The ultimate thing is love itself, is what does love look like in our city? What does it look like to really love those who are unlovable? When you say love God, love your neighbor, who is your neighbor that's not like you? And then how are you loving them well? When would they say they feel loved by your church? And so that to me is the bottom line is your community experiencing love? And then when you say you love them, is your system prepared to receive them and develop them all the way through? Or are there literally glass ceilings, in your church where there's going to be stoppage points? So to me, a lot of the churches aren't positioned to receive people that are the misfits and the outcasts.
Those stoppage points that we should be looking for, because some of us might not even be aware of what they could be.
Yeah, I think they have to deal a lot with what we consider sins. Like, for example, we put up with a lot of gluttony or people who suffer from eating a lot. We put up with divorce, people who had divorces. We say, God forgives. And we let them all the way through where they could be elders and pastors even. But when it comes to like the outsiders, like the undocumented, the people who are different than you in political persuasion, the gay community, I think there's glass ceilings. And so I think our church isn't prepared to know how to deal with that because we have a membership-based model where there's certain types of things that you have to be like to be a member. Whereas like an academy model, it's just like, if you're willing to learn, we're here to walk with you in the learning. But our church isn't positioned like that. So we had to reposition our church more like a learning model where there's more participants versus like membership. It's really a governance thing too, because the governance doesn't allow, a lot of our church doesn't allow for people to move through a way where if they're really seeking God, they can keep moving forward. There's going to be stoppage points with membership, with leadership, who they can hang out with, if the church is honest. I think the future, the love thing is really important in terms of integrity, because the people know that God is unconditional in love. But the way they're seeing the church, they don't see the church that way. And so it's going to be the challenge of the church to figure out, well, how do we demonstrate love without compromising our convictions? And can there be a way where maybe a person doesn't believe like I do, and maybe has a sin that they're struggling with, but I'm still going to respect and love them, and there's not going to be a glass ceiling for them? See, that's the challenge for the church. If we can't address that, I don't think they're going to think the church as an integrous church. I think they're going to see it as a fake church. You don't really love. And we'll make arguments for it, like, well, we're not going to go down that slippery slope. And I said, where it breaks down to in terms of like pragmatically is if this is your son or daughter, how do you want the pastor in that neighborhood to treat them if they're in like a university in their region? If your son or daughter is an addict, if your son or daughter is undocumented, if your son or daughter is gay, how do you want that pastor to receive them if they're seeking God? What are you going to say to them?
Yeah, but Dave, that sounds hard. I want something easy.
I know. It's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, I mean, you use the term offering love while not compromising on our convictions.
Yeah.
And I think that right there is the crux for most of it. We're just afraid that any conversation and any listening to someone whose sin is different than mine
Yeah.
is inevitably going to lead to a compromise on that sin. And yet we, like you say, we don't seem to be all that bothered about our own sins. You listed a few of them, and I could throw out greed and arrogance and pride and a whole bunch of other things out there that we, in fact, often reward in the church rather than seeing problems with. So on the left and the right, you've got this list of sins, and it's like if you're on the left, you aren't allowed to have any problem with any sexual sins. And if you're on the right, you're not allowed to have any problems with sins of injustice.
Exactly.
But the
Exactly.
Bible concerns itself with both of those things.
Exactly. Exactly.
And that messy middle of trying to address all of that in an equal way and with Christ-like character is so difficult, especially as polarized as we are politically and everything else. And then in my context, even the polarization of the small church to the big church, where the big church people come along and look at a small church and think, well, you're just not trying and you're settling for less. Or the
Right.
small church that looks at the big church and go, well, you must have compromised something to get that big.
Yeah, right.
Right? How do we push into those difficult spaces? How do we serve people without compromising our convictions? Is it just simply, well, I want to ask if it's just simply, I'll just leave it out there. How do we do that without compromising our convictions? What advice would you give for people who are worried that that might take place? If I reach out and carry on a conversation with someone whose sins are different from mine, with someone whose sinful behavior is the kinds of things that I've been condemning roundly from the pulpit recently. How do I change that to a conversation? And how do you address them and address the fears that they're feeling right now?
Yeah, it's the work of the Holy Spirit. At the end of the day, I don't know if that anybody can be taught it unless they're ready to hear and to ponder it. So it's really the work of the Spirit. So you don't try to argue with anybody. But if a person wants to discuss it, I lead them to several passages to look at. I said, take a look at Romans 14. I said, Romans 14 is a good passage to identify as the strong and the weak. And it says, like, the strong person thinks that the weak person's not legitimately doing the right thing. And the weak person thinks the strong person isn't. They both think they're strong. But Paul says, hey, sit around the table, respect one another, still eat together, and let the Holy Spirit convict them of their sin. And so I
Yeah.
said, that's a really good model on polarizing issues. I said, the Romans 14 model, it's what I call the and way, or the third way. That's not either or. Sometimes it can be both and. It's living in the tension that they don't agree with you, you don't agree with them, but you still can demonstrate love and respect and still work together. We do that all the time. We did that with Russia during world wars, where we partnered with someone that we said we're communists. But then when Hitler was the one that we were against, it became clear we can partner together. So to me, it depends if we really see what the war is, what the true battle is. It's not one another. And then we can trust that the Holy Spirit is going to be the one to kind of work those things out. The second thing that helped me was the understanding that I grew up with exegetical methodology, going to seminary, the Bible, the primacy of the Word of God, which is critical. And so, so I'm all about the Word. But I think I became so much about the Word that I didn't look at sometimes passages like Matthew 5 through 7, where there seemed to be an ethic of Christ. And it seemed Jesus lived by this ethic more than some of these laws that were very specific. And it's no doubt they're in the scriptures. Jesus would seem to break some of those things, like the Sabbath, and the healing of people. And so why would he break that? And it's because love would supersede the law. There was an ethic he lived by. And I was never taught that, man. I was just taught dissection of here's the truth without the contextual biblical theology of these ethics of Christ.
Yeah, the spirit of the law over the letter of the law.
There you go. Yeah. So again, I don't doubt that it may be a sin for a person that they can't do what I think is legitimate. But I said, can we still love each other? And then practically, again, what I always tell people is if this is your son or daughter, how do you want them to be treated? That helps you a lot to bring it to a practical reality.
And also, of course, because it points back to the outlines in the New Testament for church leadership requirement. It comes back to being people of character and how you treat your family, because the church is a family. So let's act with integrity within the church family, and let's use how you do that in your home with your own family as the evidence of whether or not you're going to be trusted to do that in the church family.
Exactly.
So I think that phrasing of how would you want your son or daughter, or for those who are older, your grandson or your granddaughter, to be treated in that situation, and let's treat them that way. I think it's a wonderful picture. Dave, thank you so much for your time today. I learned about the history of Newsong, things that I didn't know, and the decisions that you've made that were Holy Spirit guided, and even your advice to say, this is a work of the Spirit, because that's how it happened in your life. You didn't follow a technique or a method. You listened quietly to the Holy Spirit over a ridiculously long period of time. When you're in the middle of it, it must have felt never ending.
That's horrible.
And now, even just a few years on the other side of it, to be able to look back and see the richness and the depth that the Lord does when you give him the time to patiently wait upon us to catch up.
Yes, exactly. No, thank you for that. You're exactly right. Yeah, I don't want anybody to walk away thinking it was easy. It was horrible.
Yeah. Oh, 15 years ago, when you were talking about the potential going to Bangkok, I was going through my season of questioning, wondering what was going on. Took time away. People since then have called it sabbatical. I don't know if you can call it a sabbatical if you did it because it was a breakdown.
Yeah.
But that was the first time I attended Newsong, and I believe that Sunday you spoke about you were heading to Bangkok.
Oh yeah.
I know
Oh
it
yeah.
was. I
Yeah.
remember that. So it was
That's
about
right.
15 years ago. So you and I were in very similar emotional places at about that same time.
That's funny. Look what you produced. Your book's really good. I enjoyed it. It's like, and it was 20 years ago now. It wasn't 15, it was 20 years ago almost. Yeah, and look what God's done though. I think, you're ahead of the game, and God's showing you some direction. The small is beautiful to me. Whether you're small or big, the thing is to focus upon developing well the one. If this is your son or daughter, how would you want them equipped? And so that's how I really designed what we do, create a customized boutique academy that would launch our children into the future.
Dave, I appreciate your heart today. I appreciate the wisdom that you've shared. I appreciate the ministry and the way you have impacted the county that I live in. I am a direct beneficiary of your ministry, and I'm grateful for it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carl. It's good to be with you, man.
I love Dave's testimony of biblical faithfulness. He and Newsong Church are such a great example of what I write about in Desizing the Church in several ways. First, Dave and the church went counter to the common narrative of the American church growth movement. Secondly, he purposely decided to reach those who were, as he said, most unlike us. This is counter to everything that I was told for at least 30 years of pastoral training, but I think Dave is right. In fact, I'm sure Dave is right. Thirdly, I love how he was vulnerable and honest about the price he had to pay for those choices, but still stuck with them. And finally, I really appreciate how Dave has called the church itself to account for the ways that we've allowed our consumeristic tendencies to replace the way of Jesus. Next week, I'll be talking to columnist and writer Dan Darling about how to use a God-given platform to promote things that are worth promoting while avoiding the dangers of chasing size and celebrity. And once again, a reminder that my new book, Desizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession on What's Next, is available everywhere you buy books, either electronically or in print. And if you'd like me to speak to your group, reach out to me at carlvaders.com/contact me. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaders. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Carl Vaders, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.